Welcome, Dr. Fertig. Thank you so much for being here with us on Cancer Immunotherapy and You Patient webinar series. I will start by asking you about your research and how you're using artificial intelligence and machine learning in your laboratory to advance cancer immunotherapy research.
So my lab does a lot of work trying to use a combination of computational methods largely, which include machine learning and artificial intelligence, but also span to additional methodologies in order to understand cell-cell communication. And that's very important in cancer immunotherapy because tumors are composed of a large number of different cells, some of which are immune cells, some of which are cells that block the immune system, and some of which are the tumor cells. And so we want to use these technologies that enable us to measure all of these cells, as well as then computational methods to figure out how these cells communicate with one another to figure out when patients are going to be responsive to immunotherapy or not. And the idea is that we hope if we have a better mechanistic understanding of why the cells aren't responsive to immunotherapy, that those are going to be the cases that we can develop vulnerabilities in order to design new therapies to target them.
I was looking at some of your earlier works, and I suppose you were earlier trained in weather predictions and you were using mathematical models for weather prediction. So, how was this journey from weather prediction all the way into cancer immunotherapy? How did that happen?
So I entered cancer research about the time when there was a lot of high throughput data just coming in. So at the time it was microarrays and the Human Genome Project was just being completed. And so it gave an opportunity for huge amounts of data that really had never been in here in cancer biology in order to start understanding the system. And so at the time, a lot of, I was trained as an applied mathematician. Applied mathematicians tend to have multiple areas of application that focus on using the same theory. And so I was working on problems in weather in terms of how do you integrate different types of high throughput data with predictive models to figure out where the system is going. And so it seemed like a very natural time with the starting emergence of high throughput data in cancer to really start thinking about applying that same type of paradigm. I always sort of assumed I'd be developing a research program that focused around data integration in different domains, and ended up falling in love with the fact that in cancer biology and biological systems, we don't know the underlying ground truth. And so these systems not only give us an ability to predict, but also give us an ability to learn the fundamental rules of biology in order to have an advance for human health.
Is there any specific type of cancer which you are targeting right now? Any specific focus of your research?
Most of our work is focused on pancreatic cancer these days. And understanding, as I was talking about with all these cell-cell communications, pancreatic cancer is particularly complicated. It's got a very low burden of tumor cells relative to other tumors. And in spite of that, it's very, very deadly. And it has a lot of other cells in it that block and trick the immune system from acting. And so we want to understand those so that we can start to target this deadly cancer and maybe even see, can we understand it earlier stages of the disease where maybe patients have more of a hope for treatment as well than later stage pancreatic cancer.
We have been talking a lot about pancreatic cancer, and there is so much that needs to be done in terms of trying to treat the pancreatic cancer. So, what are there any specific new discoveries that are in the pipeline that we should be looking forward for, at least for pancreatic cancer?
So to me, I think the biggest hope is going to come from earlier detection and more detection programs. And so the more that we can do to understand the development of early pancreatic cancer and then detect it in non-invasive or routine screening, the better off we're going to be. And so I think that needs to be a major, major effort. Obviously, there's been huge advances in the disease in terms of KRAS inhibitors to target the driver mutation in pancreatic cancer. as well as vaccine strategies and combination immunotherapy. So I think we're at a point where we also have hope for treatments in later stage pancreatic cancer. But the more we can do to transition those into earlier detected tumors, the better off patients are going to be.
Just to piggyback on the cancer vaccines program and pancreatic cancer, uh, is there anything really remarkable happening in terms of how AI and machine learning can help in developing cancer vaccines?
So there's a lot of work being developed in terms of trying to understand the personalized vaccines, in terms of understanding how immune responsive vaccines are. One of the things that I want to get across about AI and these types of approaches at large is they are so dependent on the data that goes into them. So AI approaches are very, very data hungry. And one of the limitations of these approaches is that the algorithms for understanding the immune response of mutations have not been trained in the diverse populations that reflect our patient population. And I would like to make a call to everybody. We really need to think before we just blindly implement AI-based approaches in the clinic of, is this something that was trained in an accurate way for all the different groups and all the different patients who are going to be treated with this, and leverage a lot of caution before just jumping into an AI approach for therapy. So yes, there's a lot that AI can do in terms of finding those responses, but we need to make sure it applies to all people.
I know that algorithms have been there forever, and like we people have been trying to use them in different ways, as you yourself have used them for weather prediction, and now you are trying to model them into cancer immunotherapy. I'm just trying to see how automation is helping this effort move forward, and how machine learning can we do automation for predicting the biomarkers or predicting new epitopes for developing cancer vaccines at a faster rate?
So the reason AI has made such a big advance in cancer research now, and at large in a lot of domains, you're right, it doesn't have to do with the development of new algorithms so much. Those have been there for a while, and there's been a very, very long history of data science at large being applied to cancer research. What's newer now is the amount of data that we have that really enables these tools to learn a whole lot more, right? And so again, this goes back into the previous question of, you really need to think, what is the data and what is the question that's being asked, right? And so that's the first critical thing. So there's probably some, basic diagnostics of yes, no, do you have cancer, right? In very clear-cut cases, that those probably could be ready for more of an automated AI-based or human-guided AI-based approach where the clinician is really embedded in the loop with that. There's other problems that are more subtle, like, is this gene going to be immunogenic in this tumor? That the AI approaches maybe can get you part of the way, but you still need the experimental and the other basis there in order to validate. And so I think there's a whole range of things that can happen, and it's all going to depend on the question that you're trying to ask. So that, I think, is the first foundation that needs to be decided. Once you have the question and domain that you're working with it and the data sets that you're working on, only then can you start thinking about the automation of the process. And yes, the more we can automate, the more robust these tools are going to be, but you need to know their performance. And so, the automation is arguably the easiest part of the process in terms of coding. But what's harder is knowing, is this what's best for the patient? Is this what's most accurate? Is this training data unbiased and robust? And are we getting predictions that really are reflective of what we need to treat patients best?
That brings me to my next question. How do we make sure that the data that we are inputting is robust enough? So, is that a more collaboration with the multidimensional teams that we are looking for, or is it more clinical trial data that we should be aiming for?
It all comes down to what question you're asking, right? So if you want to understand, develop a biomarker of yes, no immunotherapy, right? Like, will be effective in this patient population or not. There you need large scale cohorts of patients treated with immunotherapy, right, with your biomarkers of interest. If it's going to be, do I have cancer? Yes, no. That's going to be, something that could be gleaned from, arguably the clinical records where those diseases, where, you have that more from patient populations at large. If it goes even more mechanistic to the work that we do, where you want to understand the mechanisms of response and resistance to develop new agents, then yes, you need more trial data. But also don't forget our colleagues who are doing, bench basic science as well, who have a lot of experience in terms of preclinical models and understanding how the immune system works, that those can experimental systems and even, data from a petri dish or from a mouse model of cancer can also provide very valuable insights into those mechanisms. And so we really need a team science-based approach that integrates the computationalists with the experimentalists and also the clinicians, where it's sort of the three groups working together in order to make this advance.
We are talking about the benefits of AI, like it can get things done faster at a higher rate. We can process the data faster. Are there any drawbacks to this kind of approach towards immunotherapy?
I think the drawbacks are two things. Like I was saying, the diversity is very important. If it's not trained in diverse populations, your AI might not be accurate across the board. And that's something that you absolutely need to know and we need to address as a community. The second piece is that, anybody who's, toyed around with Chat GPT, it can make funny mistakes, right? Like AI, you have to think of AI as taking all the data in the world and finding the most average answer to a question that's out there, right? And that's what it's doing. And so you have to make sure that you take that with a grain of salt and understand the pros and cons and limitations of that in order to start working with it. And so, again, extreme cases where it's a very cut and dry situation, right? Like this patient has, MSI high status, for example, and is high tumor mutation burden and is clearly within the biomarkers. Those are cases that I think AI is going to do very well and could expedite the process. Cases where it's a little less cut and dry, I think we want to be really careful to look at what's going on. The other thing with AI is if you're using it for imaging or other modalities, is one of the things is it can be sensitive to things that you don't know what it's picking up. So a lot of AI methods, we don't know why they're working the way they do. And so, for example, there's very famous cases with AI where there were two cohorts of patients, right, taken from different hospitals where there was different outcomes. And then what AI was doing is it was learning the barcode for the hospital, right? And then making predictions based on that. And since you don't know where it's predicting, right, it might not be getting the most relevant features. So also doing a little bit of digging under the hood to understand why it's making those decisions and making sure that those are rational in a field called interpretable AI think is very important.
So my next question would be something to do with what I think you mentioned last year in AACR. It's about moving from like precision medicine to predictive medicine. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
When we use AI or a lot of these tools, right, we're focused on making a classifier, right? I have all this data. I have my data from my current patient, at the time of measurement. What treatment decision should I be making? And it tends to be, very binary, like, yes, no, I should be using this therapy. One of the things that I worry about, and then this comes back to my background in weather forecasting, is that when we do this, we're completely disregarding the fact that tumors change over time and they start to develop metastases, they start to develop new mutations, they start to develop resistance to therapy. And so when we make these treatment decisions or tell the patient what's going to happen, we're focused really only on the here and now. And which is reasonable, except the tumor is going to do something later to change. So what I would like to make a call to the community is that as we're using these techniques, and we want to think sort of with AI, but also remember there's a whole suite of computational methods. AI is just one of them, right? So there's a whole suite, we're a whole diversity of computational techniques. We also would want to use techniques that enable us to try to understand how that tumor is going to change over time. Because let's say you're treating based on where something is, but then you find a different mutation is what's going to end up giving the patient the metastasis. Wouldn't we be way better off doing a preventative therapy to combat that mutation that's causing a metastasis, as opposed to focusing on the dominant mutation that we see now that might be able to be controlled by the tumor immune system?
My next question is going to be a little bit about it's more towards the general population as well as researchers as well who want to get into a little bit about data science and they possibly have some experience or maybe not. So if somebody wants to start working towards data sciences, what would be your suggestion? Where do they start and how do they move towards automating their research?
The automation comes in with the learning data sciences. And I think the first thing people need to understand is data sciences is not some automated pipeline, right? It's not something that you just sort of blindly apply to the data and you get out an answer. It's incredibly sensitive to knowing the quirks of your data, knowing how accurate it is, knowing its quality, and knowing where it fits in the context, and knowing what series of steps to do next. And so I think the first thing in learning that is learning that, just like any scientific process, data science is another set of experimental tools that aren't just somebody automatically typing something in a computer. There's somebody understanding the deep methodology and the nuances of data types in order to work with their data. So I think that's the first thing that really needs to happen, is understanding what that means to learn data science. The second thing is learning the foundations of the techniques, right? So, there's a number of workshops out there that my colleagues have created to their credit to train people in how to do data analysis, right? So there's a number of things that make it easy to get in and start learning how to code, learning how to work with it. But I would encourage anybody who's learning data science and starting to learn how to work with these data sets to also learn, introductory statistics. Why are the techniques doing what they're doing? When can you trust them? When can't you? How do you explore data and evaluate its quality? And how do you sort of figure out what types of questions that you can ask with a given data set, and what are the limitations and strengths, so that you can string together a series of tools to start answering relevant questions?
That's really helpful. Thank you so much for that insight. Uh, so what is that is most exciting for you in the coming days? Like anything exciting that you feel that is going to be revolutionizing the whole field of data science and immunotherapy as such?
Again, there's so many advances to the availability of data sets, and with that, AI tools that enable us to understand, different things. So for example, in imaging data, people are getting more and more refined in terms of what they can learn from H&E images, which gives us an amazing potential to go back and unlock the clinical biobanks in order to really study them and figure out what's going on in a much larger scale. And not only for research, but to get into community hospitals where there might not be access to the fancy technologies that I have at Johns Hopkins to study a patient, that could be more broadly scalable. So I think trying to work across different data types that are broadly accessible is going to be absolutely critical. And tools that enable us to get to things that are used in the clinic are going to be central to improving patient care.
In your research, so what are you mostly focusing on in terms of identifying biomarkers or identifying new antigens for cancer vaccines? So, are there any specific target areas or pathways that you are looking for?
So as a computational biologist, we tend to be a little bit less focused on single pathways. That's not really our domain knowledge of expertise, right? And you talked about sort of earlier what was the hardest thing about getting in and transitioning to the field. As a mathematician, you're very much taught to abstract and make concepts more sort of generalizable. So this idea of sort of one gene or one pathway and naming all the different ones is very antithetical to how mathematicians think and was probably the most difficult thing for me entering the field. So a lot of what we're focused on is really more a multi-scale understanding, right? So in some tumors, it might be a specific antigen that drives, the response. Whereas in others, it could be that same antigen could be present, but it's surrounded by fibroblasts. And so what we really want to do is abstract the process. And rather than thinking about a single gene or single pathway as the right answer just because it's present, how do these different pathways interact? And is that going to impact a patient's response more globally than, just sort of a simple yes, no, this is here?
That's really impressive. And like I'm just thinking in terms of the avenues and the doors this thing opens, because being a biological scientist, I have worked only on one or two pathways. And thinking about how these different pathways actually can interact, and specifically as you were talking, how a pathway will interact within just one specific cell versus how it interacts in a tumor microenvironment, that might actually be completely a different picture altogether. So how do you manage with the challenge of such a complex system and trying to understand, make sense of all these different pathways coming together?
So that's the power of, I think, some mathematical modeling tools as opposed to machine learning or data science, right? Those really give you the ability to start piecing together and seeing the implications of what happens when these pieces are pulled together. And I think if you get to a prediction of a single pathway, then you can start to see, okay, how does it interact? What's the correlation structure with other pathways? What does it look like? And start to mine that from the data and learn those complex relationships.
What is the tangible benefit that you see for patients that might just happen within next 3 to 5 years?
So I think the most tangible benefit I would expect to see in patients is the ability for, clinicians to be able to be more reactive and responsive, and sort of some of the automation and AI of note taking and things like that is going to be really critical, right? That we're going to be able to get more information, down and distilled more rapidly. And then for the patients also having access to, more information about their tumors, more ways of querying that make the searches easier is going to be a lot easier for connecting people to the right doctors and thinking about those interactions through these tools that, yes, could have been done previously with Google searches, but might be made easier with some of the interactions with chatbots. So I think those are going to be some of the immediate things that we're going to see. In terms of the therapies, I think also in diagnostics, I think we'll probably get some of that sped up because some of that will become more automated. And then I think treatments will probably be the last stage to fall into that.
Thank you so much for giving such a nice timeline towards what to expect in near future versus what can come in a later future as well. Uh, I have just one more question. This is more towards clinical trials and the data that clinical trials generate, because that has been always a case that clinical trials generate so much data. And can we effectively utilize each and every piece of that data that is being generated from the clinical trial, and how having more and more clinical trial data is going to benefit cancer immunotherapy?
So I think the biggest thing we need across the clinical trials is honestly data standardization. So we have a ton of data, but it's very disparate, right? So each trial has a different primary endpoint and biological endpoint. Each trial has a different set of assays that it's using, and so as a data scientist, that can be very challenging of how do you bring all this information together to get a holistic picture. So I think working together as a community to figure out what are the most critical biomarkers that we think are there in immunotherapy? What are the most critical pathways that we think are going to be treated? What are the pathways that maybe historically have been tried but have had adverse events, and so people have disbanded it? Can we get that information also collated so that we as data scientists can analyze it with an idea of really putting the patient and patient experience and treatments at the forefront of our models as opposed to something that's learned later.
That's so aptly put. Thank you so much, Dr. Fertig. This was lovely chatting with you, and thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. This has been a pleasure.